So I'm going to read a brief introduction for Ta-Nehisi, rather than improvise myself. Something very beautifully written that I think captures the full scope and scale of his achievements. So, in his work as a National Book Award-winning writer and national correspondent for The Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates has emerged as an essential voice for our times, which I absolutely concur with and couldn't have said it better myself. Coates has been compared to James Baldwin and praised as required reading by Nobel Prize winner Toni Morrison. He addresses audiences across the country on urgent cultural topics, including but not limited to discriminatory housing policies, mass incarceration, and his own personal experiences growing up in the United States as a black male, and specifically in Baltimore, as we'll hear. Coates' newest book, We Were 8 Years in Power, An American Tragedy, is a collection of his writing from the Obama era, including never-before-published essays. And since 2016, Coates has also written Marvel's The Black Panther comic books. In 2015, his book Between the World and Me was a #1 New York Times bestseller, as well as required and recommended reading at over 400 colleges and universities across the United States. This book was structured as a letter to his teenage son. It moves from Baltimore to Howard University to New York City and to Paris, addressing what it means to inhabit an African-American body in today's America. Ta-Nehisi Coates grew up in West Baltimore and attended Howard University, and he currently lives in New York with his wife and son, and is a distinguished writer in residence for New York University's Carter Journalism Institute. Very long introduction and entirely warranted. Ta-Nehisi.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Don't feel guilty if you didn't stand. It's good to be home. Although this is, I was saying, it's always weird when you grow up as a child in a city, but don't spend much time living there as an adult, because obviously I didn't spend much time over here as a young man. It's funny, how cities are. You say you're from Baltimore, but you're from a particular Baltimore. This book, Between the World and Me, is very much about coming out of that particular Baltimore that I grew up in. It's not my most recent book, but because I'm here, I think it's the most appropriate book. In 1986, I think it would have been 86 or 87, I was in my last year of elementary school at Callaway Elementary, and I had to, I don't even know if Callaway's still around, but it was. And I had to, go off to middle school as everybody does. And I ended up at Lamel Middle School. And it was so funny because I was just, I was just backstage with my friend McKay Woods, and she was with a young lady who was from Lamel, and I was just so happy to actually see somebody who's actually at Lamel. I was there when I was there, so that was like a phenomenal experience. It was not such a phenomenal experience when I first went to Lamel. Like I said, Lamel's in a particular part, or was in a particular part of Baltimore, but it's an experience that I do not regret. It is one that stays with me, wherever I am, whether I'm in New York, whether I'm in Aspen, Colorado, whether I'm out in LA, whether I'm in Paris, wherever I am, the experiences I had at that school were crucial. And I think a great deal of them were, in fact, traumatic. And it's only after I wrote Between the World and Me that I would have phrased them that way. A lot of times we go through hard things when we're black, and, we think it's great that we went through those hard things. And I guess as you hear me talking, you can hear I'm a little conflicted on it, right? Because it was traumatic, but I wouldn't give it back. Do you know what I mean? I feel like I learned some deep, essential truths about people and about humanity, I would say. I would not overstate that. I think humanity. This was, as I mentioned, in the 80s. And if any of you, were around here in Baltimore in the 80s, it was a tough time. It's the era of, skyrocketing teen pregnancy, crack era, guns, everything. Just a, a period of deep, deep fear in the black communities here in Baltimore. And I thought I would read just a little bit about what it meant to be raised amidst that fear and how that fear shaped me and the effects it had, and just processing it at the time. One of the joys of being able to write this book is I was so confused. We lose, maybe a lot of kids in general, but just speaking from my experience, we lose like a lot of black boys right around that middle school period. And I don't think we're always cognizant of how many things are being thrown at them. Most young boys who were my age, going into middle school, were worried about, as I say in the reading, the little small things of American bourgeois childhood. In my neighborhood, we didn't really have those small things. We had the responsibilities of school, and then we had an entire weight put upon us that even if in the immediate sense was being represented by the violence and the drugs and all the other negative forces around us, was in fact generational and went back to 1619, the moment African Americans first arrived, or the moment Africans first arrived in this country. I'm gonna read about the immediate weight and what it felt like at that time to be a young man. And I am afraid. I feel the fear most acutely whenever you leave me. But I was afraid long before you, and in this I was unoriginal. When I was your age, the only people I knew were black, and all of them were powerfully, adamantly, dangerously afraid. I'd seen this fear all my young life, though I had not always recognized it as such. But it was always right in front of me. The fear was there in the extravagant boys of my neighborhood, in their large rings and medallions, their big puffy coats and full-length fur-collared leathers, which was their armor against the world. They would stand on the corner of Gwynn Oak and Liberty, or Cold Spring and Park Heights, or outside Mondawmin Mall, with their hands dipped in Russell sweats. I think back on those boys now, and all I see is fear. And all I see is them girding themselves against the ghosts of the bad old days when the Mississippi mob gathered around their grandfathers so that the branches of the black body might be torched and cut away. The fear lived on in their practiced bop, their slouching denim, their big T-shirts, the calculated angle of their baseball caps, a catalog of behaviors and garments enlisted to inspire the belief that these boys were in firm possession of everything they desired. I saw it in their customs of war. I was no older than 5, sitting out on the front steps of my home on Woodbrook Avenue, watching 2 shirtless boys circle each other close and buck shoulders. From then on, I knew that there was a ritual to a street fight, bylaws and codes in their very need that attested to all the vulnerability of the black teenage body. I heard the fear in the first music I ever knew, the music that pumped from boom boxes full of grand boasts and bluster. The boys who stood out on Garrison and Liberty or up on Park Heights loved this music because it told them against all odds that they were masters of their own lives, their own streets, and their own bodies. I saw it in the girls, in their loud laughter, in their gilded bamboo earrings that announced their names thrice over. And I saw it in their brutal language, in their hard gaze, how they would cut you with their eyes and destroy you with their words for the sin of playing too much. Keep my name out your mouth, they would say. I would watch them after school, how they squared off like boxers, Vaselined up, earrings off, Reeboks on, and leapt at each other. I felt the fear in my visits to my Nana's home in Philadelphia. You never knew her. I barely knew her. But what I remember is her hard manner, her rough voice. And I knew that my father's father was dead, and that my Uncle Oscar was dead, and that my Uncle David was dead, and that each of these instances was unnatural. And I saw it in my own father, who loves you, who counsels you, who slipped me money to care for you. My father was so very afraid. I felt in the sting of his black leather belt, which he applied with more anxiety than anger. My father, who beat me as if someone might steal me away, because that is exactly what was happening all around us. Everyone had lost a child, somehow to the streets, somehow to jail, somehow to drugs, somehow to guns. It was said that these lost girls were sweet as honey and would not hurt a fly. It was said that these lost boys had just received a GED and had begun to turn their lives around, and now they were gone, and their legacy was a great fear. Maybe that saved me. Maybe it didn't. All I know is the violence rose from the fear like smoke from a fire, and I cannot say whether that violence, even administered in fear and love, sounded the alarm or choked us at the exit. What I know is that fathers who slammed their teenage boys for sass would then release them to the streets with their boys employed and were subject to that same justice. And I knew mothers who belted their girls, but the belt could not save these girls from drug dealers twice their age. We, the children, employed our darkest humor to cope. We stood in the alley where we shot basketballs through hollowed crates and cracked jokes on the boys whose mother wore him out in front of his entire fifth grade class. We sat on the number 5 bus headed downtown laughing at some girl whose mother was known to reach for anything, cable wires, extension cords, pots, pans. We were laughing, but I know that we were afraid of those who loved us most. Our parents resorted to the lash the way flagellants in the plague years resorted to the scourge. The revelation of these forces, a series of great changes, has unfolded over the course of my life. The changes are still unfolding and will likely continue until I die. I was 11 years old, standing out in the parking lot in front of the 7-Eleven, watching a crew of older boys standing near the street. They yelled and gestured at another boy, young like me, who stood there, almost smiling, gamely throwing up his hands. He had already learned the lesson he would teach me that day, that his body was in constant jeopardy. I stood there for some seconds, marveling at the older boys' beautiful sense of fashion. They all wore ski jackets, the kind which in my day the mothers put on layaway in September, then piled up overtime hours so as to have the jacket wrapped and ready for Christmas. I focused in on a light-skinned boy with a long head and small eyes. He was scowling at another boy who was standing close to me. It was just before 3 in the afternoon. I was in 6th grade. School had just let out, and it was not yet the fighting weather of early spring. The boy with the small eyes reached into his ski jacket and pulled out a gun. I recall it in the slowest of motion as though in a dream. There the boy stood with the gun brandished, which he slowly tucked, then untucked once more. And in his small eyes, I saw a surging rage that could, in an instant, erase my body. That was 1986. That year, I felt myself to be drowning in the news reports of murder. I was aware that these murders very often did not land upon the intended targets, but fell upon great aunts, PTA mothers, overtime uncles, and joyful children. Fell upon them random and relentless, like great sheets of rain. I knew this in theory, but could not understand it as fact until the boy with the small eyes stood across from me, holding my entire body in his small hands. The boy did not shoot. His friends pulled him back. He did not need to shoot. He had affirmed my place in the order of things. He had let it be known how easily I could be selected. I took the subway home that day, processing the episode all alone. I did not tell my parents. I did not tell my teachers. And if I told my friends, I would have done so with all the excitement needed to obscure the fear that came over me in that moment. Before I could get out, before I could escape, I had to survive. And this could only mean a clash with the streets around me. And when I say the streets, I mean not just the physical blocks, not simply the people packed into them, but the array of lethal puzzles and strange perils that seem to rise up from the asphalt itself. The streets transform every ordinary day into a series of trick questions, and every incorrect answer risks a beatdown, a shooting, or a pregnancy. No one survives unscathed, and yet the heat that springs from this constant danger, from a lifestyle of near-death experience, is thrilling. This is what the rappers mean when they pronounce themselves addicted to the streets or in love with the game. I imagine they feel something akin to parachuters, rock climbers, base jumpers, and others who choose to live on the edge. Of course, we choose nothing, and I have never believed the brothers who claim to run, much less own the city. We did not design the streets, we did not fund them, we do not preserve them, but I was there, nevertheless, charged like all the others with the protection of my body. These crews, these young men who transmuted their fear into rage, were the greatest danger. The crews walked the blocks of their neighborhood loud and rude because it was only through their loud rudeness that they might feel any sense of security and power. They would break your jaw, stomp your face, and shoot you down to feel that power, to revel in the might of their own bodies. In their wild reveling, their astonishing acts made their names ring out. Reps were made, atrocities recounted. And so in my Baltimore, it was known that when Cherry Hill rolled through, you rolled the other way. That North and Pulaski was not an intersection, but a hurricane, leaving only splinters as shards in its wake. In that fashion, the security of these neighborhoods flowed downward and became the security of the bodies living there. You steer clear of JoJo, for instance, because his cousin was Keon, the Don of Murphy Homes. In other cities, indeed in other Baltimores, the neighborhoods had other handles, and the boys went by other names, but their mission did not change. Prove the inviolability of their block, of their bodies, through their power to crack knees, ribs, and arms. This practice was so common that today you can approach any black person raised in the cities of that era, and they can tell you which crew ran which hood in their city, and they can tell you the name of all the captains and all their cousins and offer an anthology of all their exploits. To survive the neighborhoods and shield my body, I learned another language consisting of a basic complement of head nods and handshakes. I memorized a list of prohibited blocks. I learned the smell and feel of fighting weather. And I learned that "Shorty, can I see your bike?" was never a sincere question. And "Yo, you was messing with my cousin" was neither an earnest accusation nor a misunderstanding of the facts. These were the summons that you answered with your left foot forward, your right foot back, your hands guarding your face, one slightly lower than the other, cocked like a hammer. Or they were answered by breaking out, ducking through alleys, cutting through the backyards, then bounding through the door, past your kid brother, into your bedroom, pulling the tool out of your lambskin or from under the mattress or out of your Adidas shoebox, then calling up your cousins and returning to that same block on that same day and to that same crew hollering out, "Yeah, nigga, what's up now?" I recall learning these laws clearer than I recall learning my colors and shapes, because these laws were essential to the security of my body. The streets were not my only problem. If the streets shackled my right leg, the schools shackled my left. Fail to comprehend the streets, and you gave up your body now. But fail to comprehend the schools, and you gave up your body later. I suffered at the hands of both, but I resent the schools more. There was nothing sanctified about the laws of the streets. The laws were amoral and practical. You rolled with a posse to the party as sure as you wore boots in the snow or raised an umbrella in the rain. These were rules aimed at something obvious, the great danger that haunted every visit to Shake and Bake, every bus ride downtown. But the laws of the schools were aimed at something distant and vague. What did it mean to, as our elders told us, grow up and be somebody? And what precisely did this have to do with an education rendered as rote discipline? To be educated in my Baltimore mostly meant always packing an extra number 2 pencil and working quietly. Educated children walked in single file on the right side of the hallways, raised their hands to use the lavatory, and carried the lavatory pass when en route. Educated children never offered excuses, certainly not childhood itself. The world had no time for the childhood of black boys and girls. How could the schools? Algebra, biology, English were not subjects so much as opportunities to better discipline the body, to practice writing between the lines, copying the directions legibly, memorizing theorems extracted from the world they were created to represent. All of it felt so distant to me. I remember sitting in my 7th grade English class and not having any idea why I was there. I did not know any of the people. I did not know the worlds it was trying to expose me to. Why precisely was I in the classroom? The question was never answered. I was a curious boy, but the schools were not concerned with my curiosity. They were concerned with compliance. I loved a few of my teachers, but I cannot say I truly believed any of them. Some years after I'd left school, I dropped out of college and I heard a few lines from Nas that struck me. Ecstasy, coke, you say it's love, it is poison. Schools where I learned they should be burned, it is poison. And that was how I felt back then. I sensed the schools were hiding something, drugging us with false morality, so that we would not see, so that we would not ask, why for us, and only us, is the other side of free will and free spirit an assault upon our bodies? This is not a hyperbolic concern. When our elders presented school to us, they did not present it as a place of higher learning, but as a means of escape from death and penal warehousing. Fully 60% of all young black men who drop out of high school will go to jail. This should disgrace the country, but it does not. And while I couldn't crunch the numbers or plumb the history back then, I sensed that the fear that marked West Baltimore could not be explained by the schools. Schools did not reveal the truth. They concealed them. Perhaps they must be burned away so that the heart of this thing might be known. Unfit for the schools, and in good measure, wanting to be unfit for them, and lacking the savvy I needed to master the streets, I felt that there could be no escape for me, or for honestly anyone else. The fearless boys and girls who would knuckle up, who would call on their cousins and crews, and if it came to it, pull out their guns. They seemed to have mastered the streets, but their knowledge peaked at 17 when they ventured out of their parents' home and discovered that America had guns and cousins too. I saw their futures in all the tired faces of mothers dragging themselves onto the number 28 bus, swatting and cursing at 3-year-old children. I saw their futures in the men out on the corner yelling obscenely at some young girl because she would not smile. Some of them stood outside liquor stores waiting on a few dollars for a bottle. We would hand them a 20 and tell them to keep the change. Then they would dash inside and return with Red Bull, Mad Dog, or Cisco. Then we would walk to the house of someone whose mother worked nights, play fuck the police, and drink to our youth. We could not get out. The ground we walked was tripwired. The air we breathed was toxic. The water stunted our growth. We could not get out. A year after I watched the boy with the small eyes pull out a gun, my father beat me for letting another boy steal from me. 2 years later, he beat me for threatening my 9th grade teacher. Not being enough will cost me my body. Being too violent will cost me my body. We cannot get out. I was a capable boy, intelligent, well-liked, but I was afraid, and I felt vaguely, wordlessly, that for a child to be marked off for such a life, to be forced to live in fear, was a great injustice. And what was the source of this fear? What was hiding behind the smokescreen of the streets and the schools? And what did it mean that number 2 pencils, conjugation without context, Pythagorean theorems, handshakes and head nods were the difference between life and death, were the curtains drawing down between the world and me? Thank you.
That was very beautiful, thank you. It did occur to me halfway through that maybe you could just read for an hour and everybody would go home extremely happy. So sorry to interrupt your pleasure. So I never script questions in conversations, but in this case I felt that the occasion was auspicious enough that I probably should, and I took the leap of canvassing a few people about what they might want to hear about. And I feel that if I did not ask a more specific question about Baltimore, I would be, thrown from the museum. So I feel that you addressed a lot of it in the reading you just gave us. But I will say that the vast majority of what we do as an institution is pitched towards having a deeper, more meaningful and equitable connection with the city. It's a very site-specific kind of strategy for being a museum. So I get a lot from being here. I think it's beginning to form what we're becoming as a museum. So I was curious, to what extent do you feel specifically forged by your experiences as a young man in Baltimore?
I mean, completely. I mean, for better or worse, it never goes away. And I mean that, I was talking to reading about how if you grow up in a certain way, in Baltimore, any of these cities in America, you have to learn a way of being. And I think like one of the trap is you have to be that way in order to live and walk down the street. But that way of being does not translate into a classroom, which requires a different way of being. And it really doesn't translate into a workplace, which requires an entirely other way of being. And one of the things that I see that really frustrates me is we beat on kids because they adopt a set of behaviors to keep themselves safe in an environment that we've put them in. And then we're upset that that's the language they use when we switch the environment again. I don't know what people expect. And I go through this, for myself. There'll be times when somebody says something and I have a reaction. And I have to literally talk to myself and say, that reaction is not appropriate. That this person is not trying to disrespect you. This is not, you are not on the block. It's not, a situation where you got to deal with this dude or else, you know what I mean? You're going to be dealing with him for the next. That's not what this is. Do you know what I mean? It's like learning another language. You have to translate for yourself. And there are people who are born into the society who never have to translate, unless for some reason they find themselves on the block. But in general, they don't have to. They have the luxury of not having to.
So just riffing on that slightly, in going over a lot of your writing today, I had a time to do it on the train, revisiting certain things. It comes up again and again that you emerged as a fully public figure in 2008, roughly coincident with Obama, and there was an 8-year overlap, and you've also recounted that, recited that elegantly in your book. Now, again, this is another question that if I didn't ask, I think I would be thrown from the museum. We're now in a very different era. Times have radically changed. And I would love to hear you speak about to what extent that change has adjusted your thinking and your strategies going forward.
Probably not much. I can't say that I thought Donald Trump would win, but I was not. I can't say I was surprised. It accords with American history, very much. People like to pat themselves on the back, for the election of the first black president, as though everybody actually voted for him. And I assure you, with every year, the numbers of people who say they did vote for him will actually go up. What I always think about is there were a set of signals that were sent to African Americans, I think, specifically, and certainly certain sections of white America, on the night that Obama won, and people felt a certain way watching Barack Obama, and they felt a certain way watching Michelle Obama, and they felt a certain way watching those kids, and it sent a signal to them, a really, really positive signal. You would hear Black parents say, well, now I feel like I can tell my kid if they, they can actually be present, like that feels real. But what you don't understand, or what we don't always understand, is that there is another section of America that is also receiving an alternative signal. If you say the election of a Black president meant something, if only symbolic, if you say it meant something, then you have to believe that the run of white male presidents that preceded that African American president also meant something. And one of the things I contend is, the president is not just, a person who deals in legislation and executive orders, but there's a symbolic aspect to it. It's the closest that we actually really get to royalty. And for hundreds of years, the message that was sent was that this is reserved for white people. White people of all kinds. I mean, we've had, presidents, from the bottom, who have been, dirt poor, Abe Lincoln growing up in a log cabin, to Kennedy, whose dad is, rich and wealthy, to the Bushes. I mean, it really is, run the gamut in terms of white men that have had access to the presidency. And when Barack Obama gets elected, it says to that particular sector of white people in this country that this ain't reserved for you anymore. Mm-hmm. This is no longer exclusively your property. Mm-hmm. And we've seen this, in other areas where areas that were, in the past bracketed off to, white people are suddenly opened up. Mm-hmm. And there's a reaction. There's a reaction when Jack Johnson won the heavyweight championship of the world. I mean, riots. And so I don't know why in this time we think we're beyond a reaction.
So that is absolutely fascinating and gives me a pivot point towards art for just a second. So we as a museum had the privilege of working with Mark Bradford and commissioning him as the US representative in Venice, which is, like the Olympics of the art world. And so this is a 6'8" gay Black man from South Central Los Angeles who has now become, in my view, the greatest living painter. And I think the big subject in Venice was exactly that question, his elbowing his way to the table of power and demanding that he be seen as equivalent and or exceeding Mark Rothko, Jackson Pollock, etc., and so forth. So that was one part of the conversation. But the question everybody had for him was, what do you feel about the election of Donald Trump? And the question came again and again and again. And one of his responses was, there's always been a Donald Trump for me. I mean, look at the way I've grown up. There's always been a Donald Trump for me. He's just new to you. You've just never seen it in broad daylight before. So I was curious. I mean, do you share that? Do you share that feeling? Is that something you map onto?
Yes.
That's easy. Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't. I mean, you can be what? Ignorant, racist, misogynist, bigoted, however you want to put it, and that the heights of American opportunity can be open to you if you're white, and white male. Mm-hmm. I mean, who would this surprise? Mm-hmm. It would not surprise in any Black person raised in this country at any point in our history, actually, mm-hmm. which should not surprise any Black person mm-hmm. raised in this country, who's paying attention. I mean, in comparison, I always say, and this is not, to, I just want to be clear about this, like, this is not to wash Barack Obama or, it's not really a, weighing in on his presidency, but the fact of the matter is, to get a Black president, this guy had to be Ivy League trained, head of the Harvard, law review, he had to have all of these, accolades, had to be a senator. You know what I mean? There were all these boxes that he had to check. Mm-hmm. He had to be, a relatively brilliant politician. He had to be nice looking. He had to be able to handle himself in a debate. List of things that he had to have.
As you say,
right?
Twice as good.
Yeah, so, I mean, maybe 20 times. What did Donald Trump need besides money? I mean, so, but it's always been that way. So it's always been that way, you know? And people can't, you know, if you're white, you really can't see it unless you're really, really trying to see it. You know, you can make an effort to see it and then see it, but if you're just going through your life passively, you know, it's not apparent.
So in listening to you speak, I'm reminded of a quote I wrote down. This is, again, quite unlike me, by one of your more astute commentators, whose name I'm going to butcher, but I'll say it anyway, Pankaj Mishra, who writes for the London Review of Books, and he made a very interesting comment in the recent, very positive review of your most recent book. He says, Coates, who claimed in 2013 to not be a radical, now says he's been radicalized, and as a black writer in an overwhelmingly white media, he has laid out the various social practices of racial discrimination with estimable power and skill. So I'm curious to know, number one, whether you agree with his sentiment, and if so, or if not, what it means to you now to feel radicalized.
You know, it wasn't, it wasn't Trump that did it. It was Obama it was the Obama years that did it more than anything. I mean, I think there are writers who revel in, and intellectuals, if you want to use that word, though I don't like it, but let's just use it because I don't have a better one, revel in their ability to know. Like they know, they have the answers. And, you know, I have not been, you know, I don't want to be that. I ain't never been that. I have no interest in that. The questions are what interest me. And so, you know, I had the great luxury when Barack Obama was elected taking this job at The Atlantic and having the privilege, you know, of being able to ask, you know, all of these, you know, really difficult questions that I had not had. You know, I dropped out of Howard. I hadn't gone to grad school. I hadn't had that period that people usually have to ask those questions, and I hadn't had the sort of guides that people like me usually have. And while doing that study, I think one of the greatest things was to watch this dude who had checked all of these boxes, who was by no means radical himself at all, be greeted like he was Huey Newton. You know, like... I mean, people forget this, but you could have turned on Fox News and every night was a story about the new Black Panthers, like, and why this related to Obama. People forget this. You know, I mean, it was like this dude was bringing a revolution. You know, he was going to do the electric slide in red, black, and green in front of the White House. I mean, that's how people felt. And he was so not that. Right. And you think, wow, if this is how they greet this dude, who is like your best representative. And I don't mean the best among you. I mean, if you had to calculate somebody who you thought could communicate to the other side, you would send him.
Right. Agreed, wholeheartedly.
And if he's greeted like Huey Newton, who are you then? Who's average, you know, black dude, black woman walking down the street? I mean, who, you know, the conversations that we have amongst ourselves that are not fit, you know, if you're sending out an ambassador. I mean, my God, what would they make of the rest of us? You know, so that was tremendously sobering. You know, it gave me, you know, quite the picture on the country I lived in.
So I'm going to ask only maybe 2 or 3 more questions and then open it up to the audience in a desperate bid to remain slightly on time. Again, this is a question that I just don't think I could get away without asking. I don't think I'd leave the auditorium in one piece. It has to do with Kanye West and your most... And see? And your most... And no? Oh, you know, I can look... So it feels like there's a strong. Anyway, I took the time to come up with one quote from the article, which I enjoyed greatly. Personally, I enjoyed it greatly. You say, and so for Kanye West, I wonder what he might be if he could find himself back into connection, back to that place where he sought not a disconnected freedom of I, but of a black freedom that called back to him, back to the bone and drum, back to Chicago, back home. And it was a very beautiful way to end. And you would sort of affiliated with him very strongly throughout the article and pivoted towards the end and end with that sentiment. So I wonder if you could just sort of live reflect on your experience thinking and writing about Kanye.
Yeah, I mean, let's just state that we all agree that with much great regret, Kanye has not acquitted himself as the most informed person on American politics. Let's stipulate that, right? And so you could write a piece that just attacks Kanye for that, right? The more interesting question for me was, how do you get that way? Like, what are the processes that allow for that to happen? And no, you can't. No, you really can't, because Kanye was, I mean, if you want to trace the behavior, it begins way before Kim. And I think that's kind of how we let ourselves off, by blaming Kim. But this was like, I mean, and again, I don't want to, because I want to go somewhere else, but just to be clear, because I got that question, I mean, Kanye was, making all sorts of colorist comments before Kim. He was talking about how he was a proud non-reader of books before Kim. I mean, these are quotes. I mean, these are things that he actually said. Kim ain't responsible for him, selling gear with the Confederate flag on it. That ain't Kim. That's Kanye. And so, you ask yourself, well, how does this happen, right? And like with me, I teach this class up at NYU, and I had my kids there, and they were so heartbroken about him because they're like 4 years old when Blueprint comes out. Kanye's all they knew, and so it was this huge, huge heartbreak. And what I thought a lot about was how after this book came out, how I was greeted with 1/1000th of the amount of fame that Kanye West has right now, and how it almost drove me crazy, and how deeply destructive it was in my life. I didn't end up on drugs. I didn't end up with another kid. None of that happened, right? But it was distortive. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you have the freedom, all of you, or most of you in this room have the freedom of, you walk into a room, you meet somebody, y'all shake hands, and they, you know what I mean? And you make assessments of each other, and maybe you're friends, maybe you're not friends, but it's you. It's you. And after this book came out, what happened was I walked into the room, and some amalgamation of me had preceded me. And I can't tell you how distorting that is in your life. And I liked myself. I liked who I was. I had, this had happened to me at a relatively, older age. I think I was 40 when between 39 going on 40 when Between the World and Me came out. So I was who I was. My kid was 14 years old. I had been with my wife over 15 years. I was who I was. I was happy. I reached a place where I could actually support myself as a writer. If this was, the acre that I was set to till on this, earth, man, I got blessed. That was how I felt. And as happy as I was for the success of the book, it was like everything flipped. You know what I mean? You would have people who were close to you who would start acting a little different. Few people close to you who might do some things that, were kind of manipulative, to help themselves out. People who might not necessarily be friends, but still, you had a good rapport with. You look on your Facebook and they're attacking you. What the hell's going on? People you ain't heard of from 10 years ago got stories there. It got really, really insane. Now, what I had my son. I had my wife, had my pops, had my sister, my moms, my brother. I had a pretty solid thing around me. And I had, and there's really no other way to put this, my commitment to black people. I had that as an ingrained thing. And those things, rooted me to the ground. Now, what if you take all of that away? What if I don't have that stability? You know what I mean? And what if I, don't actually like myself that much? Who would I then be? So, as upsetting as I thought it was to see him, do what he did, I felt like, and the other thing is not only not have that, but multiply the fame by 1,000, because I only got a little bit of it. As upsetting as it was to see that, I kind of understood how he got there. I really did.
So, pivoting away from what you've done and towards the future, you said you're a question asker, you're a speculator, you're a deep thinker, and you write constantly, and you love writing.
I didn't say I was a deep thinker. I try.
Okay, it's my opinion that you're a deep thinker based on the evidence in the books. So, thinking about you're somebody who's shown the capacity to form worlds with your thinking, and Black Panther is a really good example of that. And I heard from, in conversation with your agent recently, that you've been engaged to do Captain America. And that strikes me as extraordinarily exciting, another opportunity to create a world in a different image. I think that there's a funny parallel there between, this is a micro level, but working in a museum, you can begin to forge a world you imagine within these walls, and you transform people while they're inside, and maybe they're a little different when they leave. So I'm really curious about where you are in your thinking about Captain America, what that means, this sort of shift in your practice.
Yeah, it's like, you're an actor, you know what I mean? And it's the chance to take on a role that is far removed from where I am and who I am. But I love that. That goes back to the thing I asked about, or I said about asking questions, or even the approach to Kanye. I know what I think of America, but what might I think if I were born under different circumstances, if I were a different color, if I had, different experiences? How might I think? How might I feel? I have my set of strong opinions, but they only are kind of interesting to me. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. The how people become who they become is very, very interesting to me. To me, it's like, Denzel and Training Day, right? Like, that ain't Denzel Washington. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting to see, okay, how could I be this dude? How could I be this person? How could I, become this crazy? What is that? Mm-hmm. So for me, it's just, exploration,
So my last question before I open it up to the audience. We talk a great deal within the museum about representation and empowerment that comes from representation. Amy Sherald, who is our local painting hero, a member of our board, an extraordinary woman, talks a great deal about the transformative power of seeing oneself represented on a wall and the necessity to do that, this museum specifically, to derive a different connection to the city. So on that subject of representation, I was curious about the way your words represent the possibility of a different future, and even more specifically, if you were using words to craft or describe a future, an imagined one, perhaps for a 15 or 14-year-old kid growing up in Baltimore, what would you want to represent with your words?
Oh, I don't know, man. This is why I said I'm not a deep thinker. I don't know how to begin to answer that. I really don't.
I think Amy achieves it with, she would say that she's a photographer who doesn't use a camera. And she doesn't use a camera because her subjects often don't exist, so she has to paint them.
Like for me, in my writing, I'm trying to understand why the world is the way it is and how it got that way. And that's probably where I'm at in my writing. I probably have not graduated to the level of, okay, what would another world look like? This is not an easy question. I don't. Well, let me make this very concrete. It is my argument that you cannot imagine America without white supremacy. And I don't mean that strictly as a rhetorical statement. I mean that there is no America without land theft from the Native Americans and without enslavement. It's just no, and if you can point to me how you get there without that, and not only that, if you can point to me how you get there without all the things that came as a result of that, without the culture and the music that black folks made in the pain of that, which is now like the music of the world. America's, one of America's biggest exports. How do you get there without that? How do you imagine America literally without Martin Luther King? Who better, is the better interpreter of what this country, claims to, stand for than Martin Luther King, than a Frederick Douglass? How do you imagine America without a Harriet Tubman? So that's the, the good part, the resistant part, but also the bad part. If you strip white supremacy away, well, I mean, you saw what happened when you had a black president. I mean, you ended up with a dude who is tweeting shit at another nuclear power. Do you understand? Like literally flirting with self-destruction. That was just one black president. People benefit from white supremacy. It's not just that I grew up in Baltimore and that sucked, or something like that, or somebody was being mean to me. It was that the fact that I grew up in a neighborhood that was built the way it was, the fact that it had been segregated for all the years that it had been, allowed for folks who moved out of Baltimore into the county to have the homes that they did. That's how the programs were, the federal housing programs in this country were actually passed. Those two things are intertwined. One does not exist without the other. So there is no world in which black people are respected as human beings, as people, in which white people, as we constitute them now, still exist. I do not mean a world in which people with blonde hair, blue eyes, fair skin, whatever, don't. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the very idea of white people and whiteness and the suite of privileges that come along with it. As long as they exist, black people, and basically everybody else who ain't white, are under threat. And so it's tough. I mean, because what you're imagining is like the very real destruction. Privileges that go to the root of this country. What is that world? I don't know.
So I've taken enough of your time, and you've been extraordinary already. I know we have I know we have questions from the audience, and I think it's my role to instruct people to pass their microphone. So you put your hand up immediately. So you get the first question. Right in the center there.
Sorry, y'all. Hi. So I've been thinking and reading a lot about, my name is Ende. I've been thinking and reading a lot about Afro-pessimism lately. And after reading Between the World and Me a couple years ago, and just knowing you as a figure, I've always appreciated your refusal to give anyone a happy ending, and which is why I'm so glad I got to ask your question after just speaking about that. But Afro-pessimism in the sense of just the concept that it would require that same amount of violence and that same amount of destruction in order to ever get rid of anti-blackness. And so in the idea that never. And so I was curious if you believe that that same pessimism can apply as well to black womanhood and black queerness within the black community.
Well, I would have to back you up, because other people describe me as pessimistic. I don't think of myself as pessimistic, actually. Life is tragic. It ends badly for every single one of us. I mean, that's a fact. That's a fact. But we don't think of our lives as pessimistic lives, nonetheless. That's not how we describe ourselves, even knowing that we're all going to die one day. We don't think, therefore my life is meaningless or that sort of thing. So I've never thought of myself as pessimistic. Think about it like this. Anti-Semitism in Europe, which reaches its zenith with the Holocaust, is actually 2,000 years old. I mean, you're talking millennia of hatred, you know what I mean? And, ours is what, 500, 600 years, about 500, 600 years into this? And for that to be confronted in any real way, they had to kill, what, 90% of the Jews living in Europe? I mean, that's what it required to, have those memorials in Germany. People often, they say to me, well, how do we do what the Germans did? Well, hopefully by not killing 90% of the black people in your borders. Hopefully that's not what it requires, but that's what it required for them even to get to that level. That does not bode well for deeply entrenched systems of power. And so in that sense, yes, I think it can be extended well beyond, race, or race specifically in and of itself, to other, axes or to other intersections with race. Yes, very much so. Anytime you see people being oppressed, what you always have to remember is someone is benefiting from that oppression. People don't just oppress for the hell of it. They oppress to get things. I mean, honestly, it's one of the things that I've had to think a lot about in this, moment of Me Too, where it's like, okay, I ain't Harvey Weinstein, you know what I'm saying? I ain't even Juno, you know what I mean? Like, that's not me. But yet, every time one of these stories come out, I feel a certain type of way. Like, I feel shamed by it. Why do I feel shamed by it? And then you start realizing that the reason why you feel shamed by it is because the ability for folks to perpetrate these sorts of abuses is linked to your ability to walk down the street and people not yell rude things at you. It's linked to your ability to take the train at 3 a.m. after a night party and be half drunk and not worry about somebody sexually assaulting you. Like, it's all linked, you know what I mean? To I had a hard time coming up as a writer. What I did not have was somebody say to me, I will give you this job if you blow me. That never happened to me. And so anytime you're talking about oppression, there's always a class of people that are benefiting on the other side. And so the question then becomes, what happens when you start stripping those privileges away? What does that world look like? And so I don't really describe that as pessimism. I describe that as 1 + 1 = 2. That's gravity. That's the world. It's Newton. That's the world. You live in. The work of being a human being, I think, and an enlightened human being, is to understand those laws, to find, some sort of purpose and struggle, which I do, even as I acknowledge them, and to find your joy, even within those boundaries.
So in the red shirt right there, and I'm just going to say, in order to give as many people in the room a voice as possible, we would love some concision in the question asking. It'd be great.
You can go a few minutes longer, too, because I took longer with the meeting.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Your work is very inspiring. A quick question. During Donald Trump's campaign, one of the questions he asked Black America, and I would say Brown America, is what the hell do you have to lose? Having had him as president for the past year, how would you answer that question to him today?
A lot.
And what do you think will continue to lose over the next several years?
I mean, one wants to maintain a larger critique of the electoral system, right? For instance, I understand people feeling the type of way about, like, Hillary Clinton. I totally get it. I was of that generation, that was labeled super predators. I get it. I get the tremendous damage, that was done during the Clinton era. You want to be able to have that fight and to remind people of that. And at the same time, and also had that fight, during the Obama era, right? Like, had that fight with Obama, you know what I mean? And had that fight in general with politicians who may be closer aligned to you than other politicians. Let's put it like that. And at the same time, not fall into a nihilism that says Eric Holder and Jeff Sessions are the same. They're not. They're not. They're literally not. I don't know if this actually went through, but I believe Jeff Sessions was trying to undo the police decree right here in this city Fam, you got a lot to lose. You got a corrupt police department in this city that was running like a gang. And what you lost was the ability to bring federal pressure on them. That's a lot. That's not, I mean, it frustrates me to no end to hear people say shit like that. And you will hear it from people who consider themselves, more conscious. But there should be a way where you can critique people and talk about, how they don't live up to standards of justice and fairness. And at the end of the day, still act like a sensible human being. I had this, professor who said this to me one time. People say, well, Hillary Clinton is just, and I'm sorry to relitigate this, but Hillary Clinton is just the lesser of two evils. And her response was, yeah, and I'm in favor of less evil. And that's the response. And that's just, and you don't lose your ability to yell and critique, and that, you don't give that up. It don't mean you got to back that person after the ballot box is just the start of your politics, not the end of your politics. You got a lot to lose. You got a ton to lose. You got, a dude, labeling, countries that you're, have, fraternal relationship with, the shithole countries. You got, people, just yesterday being described as animals. You got Muslim Americans, being assaulted, on the streets. You got a lot to lose. You got, people being massacred, in the occupied territories in the Middle East right now. You got a shit ton to lose. So, this notion that, it just, I don't get it. You can maintain your radicalism and your critique, and you damn well should. And at the same time, not fall into a kind of, thin, nihilism that really has no respect for people who are living day to day, on the streets, who will lose.
Okay. In the middle there.
Hi, so my question is, it was very obvious from your reading how passionate you were about this book, or you are. So my questions are, number one, I'm curious to know what you had to leave out of it. And the second one is, will there be any more performances like you had at the Kennedy Center? Because it was just amazing, and I think the rest of the country is missing out.
Yeah, they were a lot better than me. My buddy Camilla Forbes, who I went to Howard, she adopted the book and did a staging of it, and she did it at the Kennedy Center, and she did it at the Apollo in New York. Yes, my expectation is that there will be, and that's in the works. The book is, 150, 160 pages, so yeah, I had to leave out a lot. It could not be a treatise, on the entirety and all the complexities of Black life in America. It is both rooted in and limited by my perspective as a straight Black male raised in Baltimore City. That's what that book is. It's fine that book is that. But what is needed is more books. You're never gonna get it all from one book. That's actually gonna be a successful book, because then what you end up is a melange, with a melange that doesn't have a point of view, that isn't actually saying, one particular thing. What I hope that book did was, I hope it inspired people, to do their own, between the world and me's, and find their own. And some of that stuff is already there. In fact, a lot of it's already there. It's not even a matter of the book inspiring. I think a lot of it actually is in effect already there, and just deserves more of a spotlight.
Okay. No? Okay. I've lost track of who had their hand up first. How about right there?
Hi, my name is Malachi. This is for Mr. Coates. If you had any type of superpower, what would it be, and how would it?
It's outstanding.
How would it better your community?
I would think very hard about accepting any superpower that anybody offered. Because what I've learned about life is it's very rare that you get a gift and it doesn't have something attached to it. I think I'm okay. I probably would refuse.
How about just right there?
Hello. I guess my question is, I was thinking about Between the World and Me and the anecdotal story you told of the lady. I think she pushed your son as you were going down the escalator, and the guy threatens in, like he jumps in and threatens to call the police. And then I'm thinking of the two guys that were sitting in Starbucks and they called the police on him. I'm thinking about the doctor, the Stanford professor that called the police on this black family having a cookout. I'm thinking about the student, the white student that called the police on the black student sleeping at Yale. I'm just wondering, is this retaliation? It can't be a genuine fear that these people are having over these black bodies. I'm wondering, is it attached to the Trump era? Is it like retribution for Obama? Like, I don't think these things ever stopped happening, but it seemed like there's a strong surge in it. Or maybe it's just the social media millennia where people can share it now and we see it in an instant. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I would not confuse with more coverage with more incidences of it happening. It's probably always been there. You know, it's probably, it's like they've done these analysis of how shark attacks are covered. And the frequency of coverage of shark attacks actually has no relation to the actual number of shark attacks that are actually happening. So this may feel new to cover this right now, but I doubt that there's actually been an upsurge.
So I'm going to go over to this side, back there in the corner.
Oh, it's me. Oh, my goodness.
Oh. You're welcome.
Thank you. So, are we standing? I think we're standing. Sorry. There's arguably this renaissance in black art, not necessarily in the creation of more black art, but just in visibility of it. And so my question is, what do you think is the catalyst for that? Because from Moonlight to Black Panther to Black Lightning to Get Out, we are seeing more faces that look like ours being written by faces that look like ours, being performed by faces that look like ours.
I think you're coming out of an era where you had gatekeepers. I think like the rise of social media, the many platforms. I mean, you take somebody like Issa Rae, right, who starts off doing her own thing and has the ability to demonstrate that, then go to, Insecure. I think that's a huge, huge difference, as opposed to having to get somebody's blessing right off the top and then not, dictating your career. I just think it's a more chaotic place. But I also think the same thing that hurts us is the same thing that blesses us, right? Like when I was talking about like being at Lamel, like I wasn't joking when I said I learned a lot about humanity. And I don't know that I would give that back. Because you're black and because you live under it, and I would say it's probably true of, to varying extents of any oppressed class of people, you see certain things. Privilege is blinding too. That's the flip side, And so I would argue like it's not a mistake that we exist where we exist, for instance, in the music of this country. We've been under it more. We've seen some things that other people have not seen. And so I actually think that's a great power for African American creators in this country. They understand humanity in a different way. I don't know that you could be white and write Get Out. By which I mean not literally the color of your skin. I mean the set of experiences that this country imposes on you because of the color of your skin, which is different. It's not, in your bones or in your genes. It's just a set of experiences that you have. I don't think you could be white and do Black Panther the way Ryan did Black Panther. I don't think that's possible. I think you would have to have a set of experiences. Could you think of the story? Could you come up with the story? Sure, you could. But you couldn't do what he did. You couldn't have his vision, how the movie looked the way it looked, understand the importance of it in the way it did without having been subjected to a certain series of experiences. The unfortunate part about that is it shortens our lifespan by about 10 years. But the flip side of it is you see things, you understand things in a way that I think, most people in this society do not.
All right, I think we have time for one more. So I don't know how to do this equitably in any way. I'm just going to go with somebody, okay, right back there, who's been standing up for a long time.
Thank you so much. It's so great to get a chance to ask you this question. I've been thinking about it a lot. It goes back to Captain America and tags on to the end of that question, which is that, I got super excited when I saw you're going to be writing Captain America, and then I started thinking a lot about who's writing about whiteness and why. And I think there's one fact which you said, you said in relation to that question, which is I totally buy, which is that we are maybe the people who, as the oppressed class, are the people who are best suited to write about those in power, because we're the ones seeing that. But so I guess my question is, what is it going, maybe looking forward, what is it going to be like for you writing about whiteness in this way while also trying to do what you've, and pardon me if I'm, mischaracterizing your past work, which is trying to write about blackness in relation to blackness, or allowing blackness to get back at itself. I think that was what was so beautiful about your run on Black Panther, about the film Black Panther, about the what you just read, is that you're willing to kind of talk about blackness in itself without tying it back to whiteness. But how do you feel like you're going to be doing both at the same time, and what that's going to be like? Sorry.
I mean, hopefully fun. It's funny because I don't really, I guess because I've read comic books for so long in my life, I haven't thought about it that way, from a creative perspective. I feel like I'm writing about somebody with different experiences and different assumptions about their country than I have, and it's just exciting to me, just to get out of your own shoes, and see it from a different perspective. I mean, how do you deal with a guy who feels, so tied to defending America? Of course, here's the flip side of it. There's even some blackness in that. Because Steve Rogers starts off as this really weak dude. And then he gets this superpower, right? But he can't ever really forget that he was weak at one point, that he was oppressed at one point. And it is, in fact, the weakness that gives him his nobility. It's what prevents him from becoming a bully. Because he, has this memory of what it was like to be the small guy, And so there's even some of, like the black experience in that. So I don't know, and that's not because it's black, that's because, because we're human. And you can find those sort of inroads, I think, into anything.
So you've been extraordinary and extraordinarily generous with your time.
Thank you. Thank you.